June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The tide was turning when the first landing craft slowed to idle. Dawn had not yet broken cleanly. The sky hung low and metallic, the color of spent shell casings. Spray leapt across steel hulls that had crossed the English Channel all night, carrying men who had been awake since long before midnight. Inside the boats, soldiers crouched shoulder to shoulder. Their packs were heavy with ammunition, rations, Bangalore torpedoes, demolition charges. No one spoke. Some stared down at the corrugated deck. Others watched the green glow of a compass needle vibrate with the engine. A chaplain had prayed hours earlier, somewhere offshore, but here there were only the small, involuntary sounds of breathing and metal knocking against metal. The ramps dropped into water thick with fuel and cordite. Men moved forward without a word, slipping into waves that reached their chests, rifles held high. Bullets cracked the surface before most of them could find the sand. Bodies folded and vanished, yet the line behind them kept advancing, still silent, still methodical, as if the beach itself were pulling them in. By nightfall, German situation reports would describe the American landing in terms that revealed more than tactical surprise. They would speak of shock, not at the numbers, but at the quiet. The quiet is where the story truly begins. WWII, the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its fifth year, and it had become a war of exhaustion. On the Eastern Front, the German army was bleeding men and machines at a rate it could no longer replace. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 had been followed by Kursk that summer, where the last great German armored offensive failed. From that point onward, the Wehrmacht was largely reacting, shifting divisions from one collapsing sector to another, always behind the initiative. In the West, however, the German high command still clung to a defensive vision. Adolf Hitler remained convinced that the decisive Anglo-American blow would come through the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To protect the coast, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been placed in charge of Army Group B in late 1943, tasked with strengthening what propaganda called the Atlantic Wall. He traveled relentlessly along the shoreline, inspecting concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and newly laid minefields, pushing local commanders to accelerate construction before the Allies could strike. Yet the Atlantic Wall was not a continuous fortress. It was a patchwork. Thousands of strong points dotted the coast, but many were undermanned, built with inferior concrete, were still unfinished by June 1944. Steel shortages, air raids on supply depots, and the diversion of labor to the Eastern Front all weakened the system. German coastal divisions were filled with older men, foreign conscripts, and troops recovering from wounds. The elite formations were held inland as mobile reserves, waiting for orders that would come too late. Across the Channel, the Allied world was preparing for its largest amphibious assault in history. Operation Overlord had been in planning since 1942, but its final shape emerged under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander in January 1944. He commanded a coalition that included American, British, Canadian, Free French, and Polish forces, supported by naval units from half a dozen nations. The scale of the preparation defied precedent. Entire ports were constructed from scratch in southern England. Millions of tons of supplies were stockpiled: ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, rations, spare parts. New landing craft were designed and built in American shipyards, many of them assembled in inland rivers and floated down to the sea. Thousands of pilots rehearsed low-level navigation. Paratroopers trained for night jumps in blackout conditions. Infantry divisions conducted beach assaults on the cold shores of Devon, using live fire to approximate the chaos of the real landing. At the heart of the plan lay deception. Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate military ruse of the war, created a phantom army in southeast England, complete with inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, and false radio traffic. This notional formation, the first U.S. Army group, was commanded by General George S. Patton, whose reputation the Germans still feared. The goal was simple: convince German intelligence that the main invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. the deception worked. Even in late May 1944, German reconnaissance reports and intercepted communications pointed again and again to Calais. Panzer divisions were kept close to that sector, while the coast of Normandy remained comparatively thinly defended. And yet, within the Allied command, Normandy was recognized as the most complex of the chosen beaches. Codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each landing zone presented its own geography and risks. Omaha was the most dangerous of all. Steep bluffs, limited exit routes, and strong German positions meant that failure here could split the entire invasion in two. It was into this narrow corridor of sand and shingle that American forces would move on the morning of June 6th. Not with the overwhelming roar of a battlefield charge, but with a quiet discipline shaped by years of planning and a dawning awareness that survival depended on not being seen, not being heard. That silence had been rehearsed long before the first wave touched water. Omaha Beach stretched for roughly 8 kilometers along the Norman coast, bounded on either end by rocky headlands that funneled any attacker into a killing zone. Unlike the flat sands of Utah to the west or the gently rising slopes at Golden Sword, Omaha rose abruptly from the waterline. A narrow strip of sand led to a seawall, and behind it, steep bluffs climbed more than 100 feet in places. From those heights, German observers could see every movement on the open beach. The Germans called the sector WN, short for Widerstandsnest, resistance nest. More than a dozen of these nests were embedded into the cliffs, each one a small fortress. Reinforced concrete bunkers housed machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. The most feared among them were the MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing over 1,200 rounds per minute. Their sound had earned them the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw, and at Omaha, many were positioned to fire diagonally across the sand, creating interlocking fields of fire that could sweep entire stretches of beach. Below the waterline lay another barrier. Rommel had ordered the installation of thousands of obstacles designed to rip open landing craft and detonate mines beneath them. Wooden stakes called Rommel's asparagus jutted from the surf at odd angles, many topped with Teller anti-tank mines. Steel hedgehogs and Belgian gates lay scattered across the tidal flats, their outlines barely visible at high tide. The landing had been scheduled for a rising tide to shorten the distance to shore, but this meant that most of these obstacles would be submerged and invisible to the first assault waves. The German units defending Omaha belonged primarily to the 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened formation transferred to Normandy only months earlier. Its presence had gone largely undetected by Allied intelligence, which still believed the sector was held by the weaker 716th Static Infantry Division. The 352nd was better trained, better equipped, and commanded by officers with experience on the Eastern Front. They had reinforced the beach with additional trenches, mortar pits, and observation posts. Command on the German side, however, was fragmented. Rommel wanted armored divisions placed close to the beaches to crush any landing before it could establish a foothold. Others in the high command argued that tanks must be held inland, safe from naval bombardment, ready to counterattack once the main invasion point was identified. Hitler reserved personal control over the release of these reserves, a decision-making structure that introduced fatal delays at precisely the moment speed was required. On the American side, Omaha was assigned to the U.S. V Corps under the command of Major General Leonard T. Jarrow. 2 divisions would lead the assault. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, and the 29th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit making its first major landing under fire. They would be supported by Army Rangers tasked with scaling the cliffs at Point du Hoc to the west and neutralizing German artillery that threatened both Omaha and Utah. The assault plan called for a preliminary aerial bombardment, followed by heavy naval gunfire, and then the landing of specialized armored vehicles, amphibious Sherman tanks known as DDs, that would provide fire support as infantry came ashore. Engineers would clear gaps through the beach obstacles, and follow-on waves would pour through these corridors, pushing inland through narrow valleys known as draws. On paper, It was a carefully synchronized sequence. In practice, it depended on everything working at once in weather that was already deteriorating. Rough seas scattered landing craft. Smoke and dust from the bombardment obscured landmarks. Many DD tanks swamped and sank before ever reaching the beach. By the time the first ramps dropped, both sides were operating on partial information. German observers peered through haze at indistinct shapes moving in from the water. American platoons struggled to find their designated sectors, guided only by compasses and fragmentary glimpses of the shoreline. In that confusion, something unexpected took shape. A landing defined not by shouted commands or rallying cries, but by a collective instinct to advance without sound, to move through the storm as quietly as men could while carrying the weight of war on their backs. And that instinct would soon collide with the reality waiting in the bluffs above. For the soldiers in the first wave, silence was not an act of heroism. It was a physical response to fear, so intense it stripped away anything unnecessary. Many veterans later described the same sensation, a narrowing of the senses, as if the world had shrunk to the space directly in front of their boots. Words had no place in that narrow corridor. The water was cold enough to numb fingers within seconds. Heavy packs dragged men under. Rifles were held above heads, not for ceremony, but to keep the firing mechanisms dry. When bullets struck the surf, they did not announce themselves with noise so much as with absence. A man who had been beside you a moment earlier was suddenly gone. To shout was to draw attention. To move was the only instruction that mattered. Field reports written days later would note that many platoons lost cohesion almost immediately, not because of cowardice, but because silence dissolved traditional command structures. Non-commissioned officers who tried to rally their men were often the first to be targeted by German machine gunners trained to identify leadership by posture and movement. In response, survivors learned to communicate with gestures, a tilt of the helmet, a hand flat against the sand, a short wave toward the seawall. 2. The tactical angle, doctrine without words. American assault doctrine had emphasized speed, dispersion, and initiative. Once ashore, units were instructed not to wait for perfect alignment or complete formations. Every soldier was taught to think in terms of objectives rather than orders. Reach the seawall, then the base of the bluff, then the crest. If you could not find your platoon, you were to attach yourself to the nearest group moving inland. This doctrine had an unintended consequence. As men clung to the beach under fire, the only shared language was motion. Entire ad hoc units formed without names, without rank, without spoken coordination. They crept, crawled, and then sprinted in short bursts between shell craters, moving when the German guns paused to reload or shift targets. German after-action reports later remarked on this behavior with surprise. The expected pattern, waves pinned down, officers shouting, men clustering behind obvious points of cover, failed to materialize. Instead, small knots of Americans appeared to materialize at random points along the bluffs, often without any audible warning. 3. The psychological angle, when noise disappears. In war, sound is information. Machine gun fire reveals direction. Shouted commands reveal intent. At Omaha, the absence of sound became a weapon. German defenders, trained to interpret battlefield noise, found themselves scanning smoke-filled slopes for targets that were already halfway to the wire. It was not that the beach was truly silent. Artillery thundered offshore, and MG-42s chattered without pause. But the human layer of noise, the voices that usually accompany assault, was missing. That void distorted perception. Several German officers later wrote that they believed the first American waves had been destroyed entirely, only to discover minutes later that men were already moving behind their positions. That misreading of reality would deepen as the day unfolded, until silence itself became the prelude to collapse. And it was from that fractured understanding that the battle's turning point began to emerge. From the concrete embrasures overlooking Omaha, German machine gunners saw a scene that did not match their training manuals. Instead of dense clusters of infantry charging across the sand, they saw scattered figures advancing irregularly, disappearing into shell holes, reappearing closer each time. Range estimation became unreliable. Target prioritization collapsed. Telephone lines linking resistance nests to battalion headquarters had been severed early by naval fire. Runners sent down the bluffs to report what was happening were often cut down before they reached the beach. Those who returned carried fragmentary impressions. Americans everywhere, landing broken, enemy already at the wire. These were not exaggerations so much as symptoms of a battlefield that no longer made sense from above. German generals and regional headquarters nearby you and can receive conflicting messages. Some strong points reported success. Beaches swept clean by machine gun fire. Others spoke of infiltration behind their positions. The absence of shouted American commands meant that movements were often detected only after a bunker's blind spot had been breached. 5. The technology angle, when systems fail quietly. The Atlantic Wall had been built around the assumption of predictable behavior. Barbed wire was placed to channel infantry into open zones. Minefields were mapped and ranged. Pre-registered artillery coordinates lay ready for any landing site. But the naval bombardment, though imperfect, had collapsed many of these systems. Observation posts were buried. Range markers vanished under smoke and debris. Mortar teams fired blindly, guessing at targets they could not see. American radio sets were also unreliable. Saltwater-flooded handsets. Antennas snapped under machine gun fire. Communication between beachmasters and offshore ships broke down repeatedly. The result was a battlefield in which neither side possessed a clear auditory or electronic picture of events. Control reverted to the oldest method known to soldiers: watching and moving. 6. The leadership angle, authority without voice. Leadership at Omaha became physical rather than verbal. Officers led by crawling forward, not by shouting. When Brigadier General Norman Dutch Coda came ashore with the 29th Division, he found men huddled behind the seawall, paralyzed by fire from above. He moved among them under direct observation, pointing up the bluffs, directing attention to small breaks in the wire, making himself visible so others would follow. Even then, his words were often lost to the noise of battle. What mattered was his presence. A figure standing upright where no one else dared to stand communicated more than any order could. This pattern repeated across the beach. Small groups formed around whoever moved first. Ranks dissolved into momentum. Silence, at this point, was no longer a byproduct of fear. It had become a shared language of motion. And with that language, the Americans began to move upward, slowly at first, then with gathering force, toward the moment that would decide whether Omaha was a graveyard or a gateway. By mid-morning on June 6th, the beach at Omaha was a field of stalled momentum. The tide had risen, submerging many of the obstacles that engineers were supposed to clear. Wrecked landing craft drifted sideways in the surf, spilling men and equipment into water already crowded with the wounded. Naval gunfire still thundered, but it was now largely indirect, aimed at suspected strongpoints whose exact locations were hidden behind smoke and dust. At approximately 8:30 hours, the assault stood at the edge of failure. Casualties among the first two waves were catastrophic. Entire platoons had ceased to exist as functioning units. The planned sequence, tanks, then infantry, then engineers, had disintegrated into an improvised struggle for survival behind the seawall. German defenders, particularly those of the 352nd Infantry Division, continued to dominate the open sand. From Widerstandsness 62 and neighboring positions overlooking the Vierville Draw, machine gun crews fired almost continuously. Ammunition belts were fed hand over hand. Barrels were swapped as they overheated. Yet even as the fire intensified, something in the American pattern had changed. Small groups were no longer stopping at the seawall. They were moving past it. At irregular intervals, a man would break cover, run toward the base of the bluff, and vanish into scrub and shadow. Others followed, not in squads but in loose strings. 2 men here, 3 there, climbing where the slope was steepest and the wire least dense. Bangalore torpedoes were pushed beneath obstacles without ceremony. Explosions were muffled by the roar of artillery and the crash of waves. German observers did not immediately grasp the significance of these movements. The lack of shouted orders or mass formations made the infiltration appear random, insignificant. Reports to higher command still spoke of beaches contained and enemy neutralized. But behind the first line of bunkers, the situation was already unraveling. An American demolition team reached the rear of a machine gun position near the E1 draw and silenced it with grenades. Another group cut through communication cables linking strong points to their parent units. Mortar crews, suddenly without direction, began firing at guest targets, their shells landing behind their own front line. At 9:45, naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, some within 1,000 yards, firing point-blank into cliff faces. Observers on deck could now see individual bunkers. Their shells tore through concrete that had been considered invulnerable only hours earlier. By late morning, a pattern had formed. Wherever the Americans managed to reach the crest of the bluff, even in handfuls, the German defensive network fractured outward from that point. And it was along those fractured seams that the silence of the beach began to echo inland. Shortly after noon, the battle at Omaha ceased to be a defense of the shoreline and became a fight for the high ground behind it. The transformation was not marked by a single breakthrough or a dramatic signal flare. It unfolded in fragments, measured in yards of hedgerow and minutes of disorientation. Near the village of Vierville-sur-Mer, elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment emerged onto the plateau after climbing a narrow ravine that had been ignored by both sides in pre-invasion maps. They were not a company or even a platoon, but fewer than 20 men drawn from 3 different landing sectors. They carried no clear orders beyond the instruction every American soldier had internalized by then: keep moving inland. Their appearance behind the German line had consequences far beyond their numbers. They fired down into trench systems that had been oriented exclusively toward the beach. Machine gunners abandoned their positions to engage a threat they had not expected to exist. Telephone exchanges were destroyed. One strong point after another went silent, not from frontal assault, but from attack at the rear. By early afternoon, similar penetrations were reported near the E3 draw at Les Moulins and eastward toward Colleville-sur-Mer. The 1st Infantry Division, battered and dispersed, was now forming something resembling a continuous front along the ridge. It was not a clean line. Gaps remained, German pockets still held out, but the geometry of the battlefield had reversed. German regimental commanders attempted to assemble counterattacks, but without armored support these efforts were limited to company-sized thrusts that dissolved under naval gunfire or were halted by American artillery, brought ashore in piecemeal fashion. Requests for panzer divisions were relayed upward through channels that were now choked with contradictory information. Some reports claimed the Americans were contained on the beach. Others warned that the high ground had been lost entirely. The delay proved decisive. Hitler, asleep during the critical morning hours, was not informed in time to authorize the release of armored reserves. By the time orders were issued, Allied aircraft and destroyers controlled the approaches. Movement by daylight was suicide. At approximately 1600 hours, American engineers completed the first usable exit routes off Omaha. Jeeps, anti-tank guns, and small artillery pieces began to appear on ground that had been under exclusive German control since 1940. The beach was no longer the battlefield. It had become a supply line. German generals studying their maps that evening would note the same unsettling detail. There had been no single moment they could point to as the collapse. No thunderclap. No mass charge. Only a series of quiet penetrations that had gone unrecognized until they were irreversible. And with the fall of the bluffs, the fate of the Atlantic Wall itself was sealed. By the evening of June 6th, Omaha no longer resembled a battlefield in motion. It had become a ledger of loss. The sand was cratered and darkened with oil, blood, and the debris of shattered equipment. Burned-out landing craft lay at odd angles where the tide had left them. Medical teams worked in makeshift aid stations dug into the base of the bluffs, triaging the wounded under canvas sheets stretched between shell holes. American casualty figures were staggering. Of the approximately 34,000 men who landed on Omaha that day, more than 2,400 were killed, wounded, or missing. Some companies had lost over half their strength before noon. Entire sections of the beach were held by soldiers who no longer knew the names of the men beside them, only that they had climbed the same slope under the same fire. German losses were less precisely recorded, but they were substantial. The 352nd Infantry Division reported severe depletion of its coastal battalions, with numerous resistance nests destroyed or cut off. Prisoners taken during the afternoon spoke of units reduced to handfuls of survivors, their ammunition expended, their command structure shattered. The most telling numbers, however, were not found in casualty tables. They were written into the logistics reports that began to flow across the channel that night. More than 1,000 tons of supplies were landed at Omaha before midnight. Ammunition, rations, medical stores, enough to sustain the foothold that had been carved into the Norman coast. German intelligence summaries intercepted in the days that followed would acknowledge, with careful understatement, that enemy elements have succeeded in establishing themselves on the coastal plateau. The phrasing masked a deeper realization. The Atlantic Wall had not failed through brute force alone, but through a kind of operational erosion that had left no obvious point of resistance. And as both sides took stock of the day, the question that lingered was not how many men had crossed the beach, but how so many had done so without ever being properly seen or heard. In the weeks following June 6th, the German army struggled to impose meaning on what had happened at Omaha. War diaries from Army Group B reveal a pattern of bewilderment. Reports were precise about terrain lost and bunkers destroyed, but vague about how the Americans had managed to penetrate positions that were supposed to hold for days, not hours. Some officers attributed the failure to naval gunfire, others to air power, others to the shortage of mobile reserves. All of these factors were real. None fully explained the sensation, recorded in multiple staff summaries, that the defense had been outpaced rather than overpowered. For the Allies, Omaha became both a symbol of sacrifice and a case study in adaptation. Commanders noted that success had not followed the script. It had emerged from decentralization, from small unit initiative, from soldiers acting without guidance because guidance could not reach them. Training manuals were revised in the months that followed to reflect this reality, placing even greater emphasis on mission-type orders and independent action. The silence of the landing, though rarely mentioned explicitly in official histories, persisted in veteran accounts. Many described a peculiar memory, not of the noise of machine guns, but of the absence of voices. They recalled seeing lips move without hearing words, of gestures replacing commands, of advancing toward concrete and wire in a bubble of internal quiet that seemed to separate them from the wider chaos. Strategically, the consequences were irreversible. Omaha linked the American beaches to the British and Canadian sectors to the east, creating a continuous Allied front in Normandy. Within days, Cherbourg was isolated. Within weeks, German forces were retreating toward the Seine. The collapse that had begun with scattered infiltrations on a narrow strip of sand would carry the war to the gates of Paris by August. German generals who survived the campaign later reflected on D-Day with a mix of professional respect and personal disquiet. They had prepared for noise, for mass, for visible assault. What they encountered instead was a kind of controlled disorder that slipped through the cracks of doctrine. And in those cracks, the war in Western Europe changed direction, the quiet that echoed beyond. The silence on Omaha Beach was more than absence of sound. It was a moment when discipline, training, and instinct intersected with chaos to create an effect that neither side had anticipated. In the heat of battle, where bullets, shells, and fire sought to shape outcomes, it was the quiet determination of individual soldiers that altered the course of a campaign. Historians would later describe Omaha not simply as a beachhead, but as a crucible. It tested the limits of human endurance, the flexibility of command structures, and the capacity of armies to adapt when their assumptions failed. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, control is never absolute, and innovation is not always deliberate. Sometimes, it is born of necessity, of men moving forward because they must, guided by instinct rather than orders. For the Germans, the landing exposed vulnerabilities in even the most formidable defenses. Atlantic Wall or not, no concrete could compensate for indecision, delayed command, or misreading of the enemy. For the Americans, it was proof that preparation and courage could bend reality itself. That movement, even in silence, could carry an army into positions thought impregnable. And perhaps, most poignantly, the story of Omaha reminds us that war is experienced at human scale. History often speaks in tonnage of shells or miles of coastline, but is measured in the steps of men wading through cold water, gripping rifles, listening not for noise, but for the faintest sign that survival and victory is still possible. In that quiet, the beach became a threshold. Beyond it lay the rest of Normandy, the liberation of France, and the eventual collapse of a continent at war. And through it all, the memory of men advancing without sound endured, a testament to discipline, resilience, and the unexpected power of silence.